Welcome to Leaders and Laggards.
I'm Jeff Custer, and I'm going to be moderating our discussion today. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Ken Riches and Dave Swenson. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks. Thank you for leading the discussion tonight, Jeff.
Yeah, we got a great show planned. We're going to spend some time delving into the root of leadership problems and what we might do to help turn leadership problems around. And so we'll jump right into it. Let's start with a really basic question. So Dave or Ken, the question is, are leaders born or are they made? Why do you think that one way or the other?
I'll go ahead and jump in. I think that it's true that some people may have innate ability to lead groups of people to achieve collective goals. But I believe that leaders are made through observation, experience, and mentorship.
That's great.
I think that the key is having some key attributes. Empathy, a good leader cares. A service ethos, willingness to make a sacrifice to advance another's interests. Resilience, having a shared struggle. Understanding the importance of teamwork, give your time and energy to develop others. And creating trust. Simon Sinek says that every single employee is somebody's son or daughter. And like a parent, a leader of a company is responsible for their precious lives.
That's wonderful.
Well said. Well said.
How about you, Dave? What thoughts do you have about this? Are leaders born or made?
Well, it's tough to follow up, Ken, but I guess how I'd answer the question is that I do believe that there are people that are born with natural traits that help them to connect with people and influence people. And so maybe they have a head start when it comes to leadership. But that being said, I believe in my heart, and I definitely provide this message to every client I work with, that everyone is a leader, and it's what you do with that opportunity that matters. So, the good news is that, like it or not, every one of us has an opportunity to be a leader because we influence a number of people each and every day. And you can choose to become, you can learn to be a stronger leader. I've been at this leadership development from my own personal perspective for a decade now. I don't ever see it stopping. I tend to, it's something that's become maybe an obsession or passion for me. I study this stuff at least sometime every day and try and work towards myself becoming a better leader. But yes, everyone is a leader. Some people choose to work at it and others do not. But the people are born with some traits that help them maybe connect better. And that's definitely something that's a powerful quiver to have, or arrow to have in your quiver as a leader.
I love that. I was talking with somebody yesterday really about that same topic, that everybody's a leader, whether they have the official title or not. And, for those, probably, that we're targeting with the audience are maybe people who have those titles, but I always just think about the behaviors. A lot of leadership kind of goes back maybe to stuff you're saying about behaviors, and we can train ourselves with certain behaviors. And so that's why I think the three of us are probably in agreement, that certainly you can mold that leadership behavior. That's great. All right. So one of the things, I read a lot. I suspect you guys read a lot. One of the things that's always been in the headlines here this last year or so has really talked about toxic leadership. And one of the statistics I've really grabbed onto is the idea that somewhere around 2/3 of people, when surveyed why they left their job, said it wasn't because of their pay, it wasn't because of the benefits, it was because of bad leadership in the organization where they worked. And so I just thought it'd be good to help the listeners understand a little better what you guys have as a perspective. When I say toxic leadership, what does that mean to you? And maybe give some examples of toxic leadership that you've observed, in your work.
Okay, I'll start here since Ken started with the first question. And I guess, what I'd say is that I think the dictionary definition, if there is one for toxic leadership, is that this is somebody that abuses their position, their role, or their title to maybe negative or influence people in a way that, the other people have a negative outcome. I would say that, for leaders that rely on their position, and if people aren't necessarily engaged in growing past position into more of a relationship or relational leadership, or the kind of leadership where you're developing the leaders around you, you're probably more apt to be toxic than other people may be. An example that, I think most of us have a background in manufacturing, but an example that always grabs my attention is, I did some research on toxic leadership in the military, and they talked about the high suicide rate specifically for people that were deployed in Iraq. I'm not sure so much about Afghanistan, but I know that the study focused on Iraq, and so when trying to figure out what the root causes were and what to do about it, the initial studies focused on, well, what was wrong with that person, and why couldn't they handle being in the position that they were in, right? What was wrong with that person? And so, I come at it from an entirely different perspective and say, people are inherently good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with us. It's how we're developed and how we're treated that really impacts us in the best way and in the biggest way. And so, interestingly, farther into that study, what we find is that some of the most toxic leaders that were deployed into the Iraq area would actually make it a competition to see who could be hardest on deployed military assets or deployed military people. They almost made a game out of it. And as the questioning continued, what we found is that those same really toxic leaders were very good at, they referred to it as snowing their superiors. So they tended to get promoted quicker. And so now you've got these people that were very toxic leaders that made it a game out of downplaying people's abilities and beating them up. And then these are the people that are setting the example for the military. And so it's good that there's been some work done on it, but maybe not life and death consequences in the non-military sector, but there are definitely leaders within organizations that maybe don't have the best interests of their people in their mind, right? It's all about them and not the people around them. So anyway, that's just one example that grabbed my attention. Was the toxic leadership in the military.
Yeah, what a great example, Dave. I mean, it's sad to hear that example, but what a great example. Ken, how about your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually until Dave shared what he shared, I typically don't think of leadership or leaders as being toxic, but I think that was a really good example. I normally think of leaders more as either a strong leader or a weak leader. And, a weak leader is kind of, they want to enjoy the perks of leadership and having people follow them without necessarily meeting the obligations of what it means to be a leader. And, they're not developing their people, and they don't have an outward mindset asking, what can I do to help? It's more about them. And when you have situations like that, it allows silos to form, politics become entrenched within the organization, and mistakes are covered up, and the spread of information really slows down. And unease replaces any sense of cooperation and teamwork within the organization. I think back to a personal example, probably 6 or 7 years into my career. I had a manager that was just berated and scorned his employees.
Mm.
Luckily, it never happened to me. But I went to my supervisor at the time, and I kind of was just like, I said, this is really bothering me. It's making me angry to see how he's treating other people. And the supervisor just kind of like, well, that's just the way he is. And that didn't sit well with me. And I did not agree with that. And I actually went and sought some counseling on that. And one of the things that I got out of that counseling that has stayed with me to this day is that you have to be able to understand and work within your sphere of influence. And as a leader or potential leader within your organization, your obligation is to raise the information and identify something that's making you feel uncomfortable. But then after that, having the ability to let go and to not let that anger fester within yourself, because if you're angry, then you can't be the leader that you would want to follow. And you can't lead others, even as to what David said in the very beginning, that we're all leaders within the organization, even if you don't have the title, but you can't be that leader if you're angry. So
Yeah.
that was a big lesson that I really learned.
No, I really appreciate you guys sharing those examples, and what it makes me think of a little bit as I studied this topic is, I think there's a spectrum of toxic leadership, and I think about your example, Dave, where it's like the extreme. We're yelling at people and really putting people down, and certainly that's the worst of the worst. But I think there's also a spectrum to where it may not get called toxic leadership, but I think there's still other toxic leadership behaviors that folks like the three of us can help people overcome. Maybe it's as simple as a leader that doesn't communicate well. They aren't yelling at their people, they're not berating them, but they don't communicate well. And certainly employees can feel that as being toxic, and that I don't know what's going on. Information's withheld. So that's kind of one of the nuances I think I started to take a look at and really helping leaders develop is it's not just the extreme, it's some behaviors that we probably all have that we can work on. So yeah, that's great stuff. So kind of in that same vein, just wanted to open up to see, I kind of honed in specifically on toxic leadership, but are there other leadership issues that maybe don't fall into what you guys would call toxic leadership that might be worth a mention too for the listeners? Ken, maybe we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have other topics. I guess I think one of the best counterbalance to yourself is to lead by example. One of the adages that I really try and live by, and it can be difficult at times, especially if you're in a little bit of an organization that has some dysfunction. But if you complain about the leadership or the things that are happening, you can get away with that once, but if you continue to do it, you now become part of the problem. And so I think it's really important to lead by example and to not be the complainer, but be more along the lines of being a solutions provider.
That's great.
Yeah.
Dave, other things you'd like to add?
Well, I will tell you the one, I don't know if it's a bee in my bonnet, spur in my craw, whatever about this is, I mentioned it previously, I think in our last podcast, but there's literally hundreds of billions of dollars spent on leadership development every year.
Yeah.
Almost $400 billion worldwide. We're almost at $200 billion a year just in the United States. And so that draws the attention of a lot of all kinds of different people, right? Some people that are at this for the right reasons and some people that are at it for questionable reasons. But, so you've got people engaged in leadership training and you can go a lot of different ways with training, right? Maybe training could even be just a sharing of information, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of accountability for the people providing this training to be accountable for learning and development, right? And so that's when leadership really begins. When you start to climb the ladder of leadership is when you actually learn and develop yourself. And so, short little story, I spent some time responding to a request for quote from one of the local colleges. We won't name which college, but my proposal was well received, but I didn't want it to stop at just training. I wanted some meat on the bone so people could develop. And so, counter proposals back and forth, it became obvious that wasn't going to be part of the curriculum. And I said, well, then I can't support it. This isn't going to work. People aren't going to get out of it what I think some of them are going to be here for. And so I was told point blank that the job of the college was to put butts in the seats, and that struck me wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of like that's the entry. This is the ticket to the dance, but it's not what the dance necessarily is all about.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, the only thing that comes to mind, I would just add that you guys probably have heard me talk about before, and you probably hear me talk about it again. Is I think new leaders really struggle making that leap to leadership. One of the things I always talk about is you have that individual contributor, and they're a star. And that's why they get considered for leadership, is because they're great at what they do. And so people have this assumption that if I take this star performer and I move them into leadership, they'll be a star leader. And I'm here to tell you that's not how it usually works. A lot of times those people struggle because the skills and the mentality that it takes to be a leader is so different than that individual contributor role. And if people don't understand that, they're going to really struggle. And I think that's where they have a lot of risk at starting to kind of go down this path of toxic behaviors. And so that's always been one of the things I really have worked with when I'm talking with people, is how do you make that mental leap to being a leader? So yeah, and so I was just kind of transition us, I think, as I've thought through this, was kind of thinking about preparing for our discussion here. It really gets down to what's the root cause. You guys, Ray's not here to join us tonight, but I know if Ray was here, he'd have some fishbone diagram or some kind of fancy thing, and we'd be trying to figure out what's the root cause. And so I just want to throw that question out to the two of you tonight: is what do you think is the root cause of these leadership problems that we've been talking about?
So I'll go first on this one. And, for me, it's something that I preach about a lot, which is, there's that old adage that what gets measured gets done. Right. And so in any organization, what typically is getting measured are things like, did we make any money? How is our delivery? How is our, performance towards customer service and these kinds of things? But very seldom are organizations measuring anything that would indicate whether there's good leadership in the company or not, right? You don't see morale scores very often, right? And so, so I think if we want to really walk the talk, and leadership is going to be part of what we do, well, then we've got to measure its impact. And maybe that needs to be right after the safety conversation. That needs to be the next thing we talk about before we ever start talking about on-time deliveries and did we have any money and these kinds of things, right?
Yeah, that's great stuff. Ken,
That's
how about you?
Great segue into when I was thinking about this, preparing for tonight. And I think in the end, it's about the work environment, the climate, and the culture that we establish within our organizations. And great organizations and leaders, they don't look at people as commodities to grow the money. That is so often in our economy and everything we're doing. It's all about the quarterly results and the short-term gains. Whereas the great companies, they look at money as a way to grow their people. And so they've got the longer term vision, and they're looking at the sustainability and viability of their organization. And it's one thing to say, people are our most important asset, but how do you, to what Dave was talking about, and what are the metrics, and how do you really measure, and are we really putting the effort into our people and helping them grow so that we'll be here 20, 30, 40 years from now?
Yeah. Yeah. And it just kind of, Ken, I want to play off of how you almost opened the show with the traits of what you said make a good leader. And I think for me, when I really think down at the root, I think human nature is a thing that's kind of rooted in greed and selfishness. I think that's our human nature. And if you take those attributes and you put them in a leader, and if you have a greedy leader, if you have a selfish leader, you won't come close to doing all the great things you talked about, Ken. And so I think helping people recognize that and figuring out how do we help them overcome those kind of human nature traits that we have, to me, is kind of how I've arrived at the root cause. So, we're kind of getting to the end of the time that we want to have. And so maybe just real quick from each of you guys, I think going forward, we spent some time tonight talking about the problem, and I think it's good to kind of frame up the problem, but probably where it's more valuable for the listeners is, what do we do to fix it? And so maybe just as we wrap up the show here today, how do we wrap our heads around solving this problem?
So that's the $64,000 question right now. I have to ache myself at all. I guess I kind of look at it, and I don't know how easy that is to solve, because obviously we've been dealing with it for quite a while. But I look into what makes people successful in marketing and in sales, and it's the ability to tell a story. And as part of that story, you want to be able to help visualize a positive result that can come out of that. And I think that as we go forward, being able to articulate and make the person who needs to be a better leader, making them the hero of the story, as Don Miller would say in Business Made Simple, is make that person the hero of the story and let them see what a positive result looks like. And then you can start having the conversation with them about what it's going to take to actually be that hero and actually to achieve that result, and to be a more effective leader for your people, and to be a leader that you would want to follow.
That's great. Dave, last word for you.
So I guess two things for me. The first thing is I think that we need to start looking at maybe different examples of people, different icons when we start talking about leadership. And so for me, the three that I point to early and often in any engagement are Herb Kelleher, right? So what he did at Southwest Airlines, there's a reason that people go to Dallas every year and study the culture at Southwest, because it's incredible. Paul O'Neill and what he did in his time at Alcoa. And so if you're familiar with the three questions that he believed any person working in an organization with the potential to be great ought to be able to answer without reservation. If you don't know what those three questions are, I would encourage you to look them up on the internet. And then the final leader that I point to as an example is Harriet Tubman, right? When people start to talk to me about how leadership is got to be title and it's got to be influence and education and these kinds of things, I point to Harriet Tubman and I say, you can't tell me she wasn't a leader. And how did she do what she did in the environment in which she had to work? So different icons, I think, are needed. The other thing is, I believe that we've got to be able to have a conversation with people about what poor leadership is versus what good leadership is, right? So for me, if you're going to rest your laurels on having a title, a management title, and you believe that you have arrived and that's as far as you need to go, well, I don't know that I want to work for you. But if your goal is to create the kind of environment where you're developing people and organizations full of people that develop other people, sign me up. I want to be part of that organization.
Oh, that's great.
It can't be my way or the highway.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of, we'll probably use that to wrap up our time today, but kind of as the springboard, I think, for the stuff that we want to talk about going forward. So just encourage everybody who's tuning in and listening to this, keep an eye out for future shows, because I think we're going to unpack all those things that Dave and Ken just talked about, plus the stuff that Ray is going to add. So, we're out of time for tonight. So I want to thank everybody for joining our discussion today on Leaders and Laggards. And on behalf of Dave and Ken, this is Jeff Custer. Tune in next time for more great discussion about leadership and business on Leaders and Laggards.
Thanks for watching, and remember, leadership matters.